start off with a couple of contextual slides to really give some of the kind of ideas that I'm going to unpack as we move forward over the next hour. The first one is about Albert Einstein quote, which many of you probably know already. It's a good one to start with. Imagination is more important than knowledge, because we have a huge amount of knowledge when it comes to buildings and the environment. We have very little imagination in how we move forward. So it's a more imaginative path I want to present this evening. And so you see that I play out. Pamela Mang and Bill Reed are two of the strongest proponents in North America of regenerative approaches to design. And one of the most powerful ideas they present, for me anyway, is this idea that new approaches to design, and particularly the tools we use to support it, must be preceded by new ways of imagining and thinking. Again, so I'm just trying to gain some kind of credibility here. So we're actually going to wander out a little bit into things which are not consistent with mainstream practice at the moment. But I believe these are more important, and they will ultimately come down the pipe and affect the way in which we approach buildings. The second key idea, Margaret Wheaton, and this is a quote from her book, and it's going to become quite essential as we move forward. It is only through conversation that human beings discover what they care about and discover shared meaning. That's an important phrase for me, but the second one is equally important. To change the conversation, we need to change who's in it. Because I'm going to wander a little bit into a political context in Canada and the need essentially to change who's in the conversation, certainly in political leadership. That's really quite important for us. So this is a slight kind of history of basically the time that I've been involved with buildings and environment, starting back in the 1970s. You'll see pretty much in fate there, mechanistic worldview. Because most of what we do and discuss is framed by a mechanistic worldview, and I'll unpack that a bit later as well. And slightly greater down the bottom, anthropocentric. Most of our ways of looking at the world essentially are through the benefits that we individuals, people enjoy. The red basically are societal concerns. Back in the 70s, when I started in architecture, there was a widespread belief that we're in the midst of an ecological crisis, and that led to the idea of survival. We need to survive. In architecture, pretty much that translated directly into autonomy. If basically the rest of the world is collapsing, then we essentially contract, and look after ourselves. Buildings have to be self-sufficient in everything because they can't depend, essentially, on the state of the ground. Then we moved through the 80s, the energy crisis, and terms like conservation efficiency became the dominant strategic ideas in building design. We moved essentially in 1992, the Rio conference, the Earth Summit. Out of that essentially this notion we need to take greater responsibility, as a collective people. So the idea essentially of responsibility and stewardship were large overarching ideas, and we started to see the emergence very much of performance assessment, integrated design, and life cycle. Then we move on essentially to 2001, essentially there were some fairly serious 9/11, the notion of security in many guises started to appear as an overarching idea, and the language we were then using in building design, self-reliance, passive survivability, future-proofing. So I'm trying to connect in many ways the language essentially that somehow is used in building design to frame environmental issues and how that relates essentially to a broader societal set of ideas. If we move forward, now essentially I think mitigation, climate change mitigation, adaptation are the two larger overarching ideas, and pretty much now we're seeing the words of net zero energy and carbon neutrality as responsibilities we have to have. You'll see there's a bit of a shift taking place now because see the emergence of an ecological worldview, and now things become more biocentric. So again, we start to see this the discussions we have in building design and the strategies we deploy are directly shaped essentially by these broader agendas. So now we start to move, so now where I think we're moving, regeneration and resilience will be the two overarching ideas, and that will itself generate a language. The language may be localism, decentralization, dematerialization, and living systems. So I'm trying to be tracking essentially how societal concerns then translate into a very specific language and therefore strategies that we deploy essentially in building design. The more important thing, of course, is now there's a sense of urgency that's occurring. So when we start to frame that discussion, we now see we need to make bigger leaps in shorter periods of time. So that's now becoming an important frame, if you will, of the language and therefore the strategies that we're going to deploy in building design. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they've been putting out reports since 1990. The most recent, the fifth assessment report in 2013. The one consistent theme essentially that runs from essentially report number 1 to essentially report number 5 is, again, an increasing urgency. So urgency is being certainly echoed in terms of the scientific community. I don't see that same urgency being engaged with by the building design community. But it's there and very real, I think. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, again, they've been around for a long time, essentially meeting annually to try and essentially arrive at some kind of a ratification or international agreement on how do we address climate change. If we start looking at what's the fundamental nature of the conversation that's been taking place essentially at those meetings. Typically, it's concessions to be given or extracted in a very episodic negotiations. It's not a great context, if you will, for making progress. So the conversation, as it plays out in this context, is really quite problematic in that sense. So that's where this idea of essentially the conversation comes into play. The World Economic Forum, they released what they see as the top 10 trends for 2015. You can read these: deepening economic inequality, persistent jobless growth, lack of leadership, rising geostrategic competition, weakening of representative democracy, rising pollution in the developing world, increasing occurrence of severe weather events, intensifying nationalism, increasing water stress, and growing importance of health in the economy. What I'm presenting here in many ways, if we start making environmental progress in the way in which we look at buildings, clearly there's a lot of other competing agendas that somehow directly and indirectly affect our sense and progress we can make. But the one I want to pick out, you can pick your own one out of these 10. The one that for me is most important is the lack of leadership. Where is the leadership coming from, essentially to guide us, essentially to a sustainable future? And that's what I want to essentially pick up as a sub-theme throughout this talk. Where is leadership coming from? Is it coming from the top? Or, as I believe, maybe the leadership is largely to emerge from the bottom upwards. So I'm going to argue a bottom-up approach as being probably where things and real change is going to occur. I want to emphasize that. So to give you some sense, I'm from Canada. I have an English accent. I was born there, but 37 years ago, I moved to Canada. So this is my adopted home, and there are many things to be proud about being a Canadian. The extent to which we've engaged seriously in climate change at political level is something wanting. So I'm going to show you a little bit. You may be aware of this already, but we have a political system like we have in Australia. From 1993 to 2003, Jean Chrétien was our Prime Minister from the Liberal Party. He was succeeded by Paul Martin from 2003 to 2006. The election then brought in a Conservative government with Stephen Harper. Now, the important thing about this is the embarrassment that many Canadians feel. Again, there are things to be very proud about being Canadian, but this issue of Chrétien taking us in, signing Kyoto, and Harper a decade later taking us out. Again, it's one thing not to commit in the first instance, essentially to commit and then back out is really problematic in many ways in terms of how the leadership may be playing out. This is a Stephen Harper quotation. No matter what they say, no country is going to take actions that are going to deliberately destroy jobs and growth in their countries. We are a little bit more frank about that. This is a deeply problematic statement in many ways because it fails to understand that maybe we should be taxing the things which are bad for us, like pollution, and maybe giving breaks on things which are good for us, like employment in many ways. So in many ways it's a kind of a very strange but well-used argument, essentially, to say we can't essentially engage in any serious way in addressing climate change. So that's quite important. So the more important thing is, again, picking up this idea of conversation, you have to be at the table to participate in the conversation. Canada has failed to be at the table. And that, again, is so you have a conversation, but you need people around the table to have that conversation, and you would want, in many ways, one's political leadership to do that. So, what do we value? I've been very interested in many ways of ecologies around the world, the different ecologies that took millions of years in the evolution, and how have we as a species managed to essentially engage with those ecologies. So we can go to different parts of the world where essentially the landscape has been crafted essentially to capture rain, essentially using essentially frogs and eels as fertilization, to essentially permit essentially sustainable agricultural practices which have gone on for centuries and centuries. We can look at other parts of the world, southern Spain, it has its own ecology, but what have we managed to do with that ecology? Well, essentially we managed plasticulture to essentially cover essentially large expanses of the landscape, essentially to provide essentially greater food production. I'm going to take you now essentially to the boreal plains of Alberta in Canada. Again, it has its own ecology, and the way in which we as Canadians essentially have worked that land, we forested, basically we look at forestry and agriculture as a means of essentially working with the land essentially for human benefit. And that has been for the main part a reasonable sustainable practice. Now the problem we have, of course, is that we have the boreal plains are also the source of oil sand mining. So once was a very rich ecology, now essentially we're transforming that and transforming it dramatically. We've managed in a very short period of time to take a wonderful ecology, millions of years of evolution, and turn it into a toxic soup. Again, by any measure, this is not a great way essentially to treat the land. Again, if somebody can convince me this is good, for our desire essentially to reap some kind of fuel benefit from it, then it becomes quite questionable. So these images and the scale of this are really quite amazing. Go on, essentially, it's not simply essentially the ravaging of the land, but the effluents that companies practice, again, spread out, again, create greater problems. So this, for me, is a huge problem. This is a timeline showing from 1992 to 2012. I want you to notice one thing in here. This is 5 kilometers here. So you're seeing this unfold over time. So it's like it's spreading like a cancer, essentially, across Alberta. Now, again, we can say, well, that's 5 kilometers. Most of you know Canada, it's a very vast country. So what are we talking about here? Like 30 kilometers by 40 or something like that. It seems quite small. But then we actually look at what the possibility could be. The area of land which has actually been leased for oil sands development is about the same size, if not bigger, than Tasmania. So you can imagine the possibility essentially of transforming that vast land area essentially into a toxic soup in this desire to extract one of the dirtiest fuels we know. Again, these for me are tragic stories about and indicative of what do we value. We value clearly essentially this access to fossil fuels over in many ways the ecological benefits that that landscape had provided in the prior world. So it's problematic. So if you start imagining how we used to partition the land, in terms of partition by ownership, in terms of farmland, now you start to see it partitioned in a fundamentally different way, where all the major oil companies essentially have now defined essentially what they consider to be leaseable for essentially development. So it's a real shift in the way in which we see inherent value in the land. You can arrive at your own conclusion about whether you see this as good or not. So the oil has to come essentially from, the tar sands has to come from Edmonton to get essentially to the coast, to be shipped off essentially to Asian markets. It has to essentially go across British Columbia. This is a defining moment in my province, British Columbia, how we resist the extent essentially of this pathway across. So we have now this real intensive discussion unfolding, will essentially come across British Columbia to get to the market. So that's kind of a story. So that's I have to get that off my chest, okay? Before I basically say this is one of the images that Canada has essentially at oil sands exploration. I'm trying to convince tonight basically there is a large, great concern about this activity and basically a strong desire essentially. So this is an image which can be interpreted in a variety of different ways. I'm going to interpret basically the big sumo wrestler basically as the building industry. Conservative, risk-averse, bloody difficult to change, okay? And so this is the environmental movement trying to move a single immovable object. So what techniques do we use to try and change this thing? Because we've got to change it. It can't carry on the way it is, okay? We clearly can do better. So it's the mechanisms that we deploy, essentially, to create change is what I'm interested in and what basically the presentation is about to see. What works and what doesn't work. Okay, so the oil sands is one of the many bad news stories. I could pick at least another 20 about basically environmental issues and how they're presented to us, typically in very dire conditions. It's a bad news story, the way in which environmental issues have been presented to us. Again, I can go back to what we value. This is a report put out by the Royal Institute of Child Surveyors on essentially what are the primary drivers of sustainability. For me, it's a very problematic set of priorities, okay? We're only going to do anything environmentally responsible if it makes economic sense to do so. If it doesn't, we won't. Second issue, basically, we can only do it basically if we're legally required to do it. We won't do otherwise. We're only going to do it as design professionals that client asks for it. Surely we have responsibilities as design professionals to be proactive and say, shit, maybe do something. Marketing, we're only going to do this green stuff basically if it can translate into a competitive edge over others. The issues basically of the significance and importance of the natural environment or the ethical and moral reasons that go along with that are low on the totem pole. So clearly in terms of there's a real kind of problem we have here in terms of if these are perceived and understand the drivers, then we need probably somehow to revisit them. I'm very fond of this one, Oscar Wilde. Nowadays people know the price of everything and the value of nothing. Okay? So this becomes one of the first storylines we probably need to revisit. The idea essentially of now looking, it's not what the cost of green building is. It's the cost of not building green is the more important issue we need to ask. Again, it's not what the cost of something is, but what is the value we gain from it. So you kind of see, we kind of shift really quite profoundly the storyline from being simply dominated by cost to one basically where the idea of value places a much more significant role. So that's in there and in the mix. The other thing is by regulation. Well, let's regulate our way to a sustainable future. It's not going to happen, okay? There's a fundamental dysfunctional nature about essentially standards. I try to capture it in these two. This is basically, you can see what's going on here. There's a barrier there to prevent us as a driver from getting from one part to the other. Okay, so, but clearly what you're seeing is people are getting around it. So the first aspect essentially of why standards are dysfunctional is you put a standard in place, 50% of us will actually meet the standard but do no more. We've met it, so what's the point of going more than that? The other 50% will try every legal action to get around basically the standards. Okay, so there's dysfunction on two levels at that level. The other one is the blunt nature, and the universal applicability of or lack of sensitivity about how a standard gets played out. So you can see what's going on there. Some has mindlessly essentially put those bicycle signs in there, even if one of the directions doesn't make any sense at all. So I don't really believe in the regulatory framework basically as a saviour to transition from where we are now to maybe a sustainable future. It's all about this, I think. At the moment, since standards are about extrinsic motivation. Basically unthinking compliance, seeing the meet minimum standard requirements in an unthinking way. It's what creates intrinsic motivation. Instilling in us an environmental ethic. We're doing it because we think it's the right thing to do. That's, for me, the more important issue, and it's the mechanisms we deploy essentially to evoke within us an intrinsic motivation to create the necessary change for it. So that's, for me, a huge issue. So now we start to build up a case as maybe a changing storyline. This was a very big part of my life, the iconic image of this freestanding planet against essentially backcloth space. Now the storyline says this is December 1968, where we as a species ventured to the moon to discover the moon, but we look back and discover the Earth. So really kind of powerful. So we go out and venture, but looking back and realizing essentially where that space exploration come from. That is our home, that's our only home, and therefore we maybe want to reflect on it a little bit more differently than maybe we had prior to that. So it comes out, essentially, we look at a single planet, and the whole discussion from that point onwards was the limits debate. How do we live within the biophysical limits, essentially, of a single planet? So the idea of limits to growth, only one Earth, essentially, was very much the literature emerging directly after that period. It was profound. The image was iconic for a generation, and again, the idea essentially that we need to respect and understand limits. And I still subscribe to that. We need to understand that. But we have some problems associated with that. Okay? Typically, it's the limit storyline that still pervades. Most environmental discourse is essentially shaped directly and indirectly by a limits discussion. It's about harm reduction, damage limitation, and mitigation. And for a wider public, that's largely interpreted in cutting back and sacrifice. Okay? Again, it's not meant to be, but just how does the messaging, essentially, of living within limits, essentially, get interpreted by a wider public? And I would argue, essentially, the idea of cutting back and sacrifice are associated with the limits debate from essentially a public discourse. So there's other problems with it. It's only environmental. You don't typically find a strong social argument rolling through essentially limits discourse. It doesn't go far enough. And this is the point I go. Many pretty much certainly living within limits, essentially being essentially more environmentally responsible. That's important, but is it sufficient? Is it sufficient given the way in which we treated the land over the last 2 centuries? I would argue it's not. The other one is it takes an unproblematic view pretty much of scientific knowledge. Science is correct. Always correct. And it assumes basically the value essentially of universal flow of information. The information deficit model. Give people the information and they will make the right choices. Again, that's been discredited for a long time, but we still believe somehow providing better, more accurate information will actually create the change. It's important, but basically how it's packaged, how it's essentially presented becomes much more important. But the most important thing is it's not sufficiently motivated. It's just not sufficiently motivated. The limits discussion has been around essentially the last 30 years, but it's found essentially to capture the imagination of the wider public. And we need to understand that. That's pretty important. Right? It's pretty important that somehow we've been aware of this. The way in which it's been messaged, essentially largely the value story, has not been sufficiently motivated to create any substantial change. And therefore, probably we need to look at other ways of doing the messaging. That's the point I'm going to try and make. So, I'm going to argue maybe in terms of we need to change the storyline. This notion of being less bad, that somehow falls directly out essentially of current environmental. We need to be less bad. Less polluting, less energy use, less water use, etc. Now that's important. I don't diminish the importance of it, but probably in terms of we need to shift that language a bit from the being less bad to the possibility of being more good. The idea of reducing damage to create benefits. The idea of sacrifice to contribution, net zero dominating current discussions, basically maybe could be shifted essentially to an argument of net positive. Equally, we could actually say, rather than somehow seeing a world of scarcity, how do we actually start to recreate or create, in many ways, a world of abundance? Again, it's a different angle. So it's this, I think, is the new storyline, and I'm going to argue that is potentially much more engaging for a larger public. So more relate essentially to this kind of framing, if you will, of environmental issues, rather than the way in which we deployed in the past. Again, I don't want to diminish that, but again, I think it needs probably to be repackaged that can actually tell the story in a more engaging way, a more engaging manner. So, you start looking at world leaders, who we see as leaders, the most powerful leaders, I think, are the ones which are vision and value directed rather than essentially issue directed. Are the ones that essentially present a promise of hope over fear. I don't know if any of you have read this, The Death of Environmentalism by Ted Nordhaus and Michael Schellenberger. For me, it was actually a critical text because these are two deep greens. They work essentially as lobbyists for Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth. So they've been around essentially in their hearts in the right place. But in this very short essay, they argue essentially the failure essentially of the messaging to create change. But they say basically a positive transformation vision doesn't just inspire us. More importantly, it creates the cognitive space for assumptions to be challenged and new ideas to surface. When basically you're frozen by fear, not much comes out of it. So how do you create a cognitive space essentially for emergent, if you will, problems, ideas, and so forth? So it's hugely important. And they use the example of the Martin Luther King speech. If I said, what speech am I referring to, what would you say? I had a dream. 50 years ago, and it still resonates. If they argue, if Martin Luther King got up and said, I had a nightmare, he probably would have been forgotten the year after. So the idea essentially of the dream basically is being indicative in many ways, essentially of an aspiration, seems to be somehow signals to us that maybe you can still instill a long-lasting sense of, many ways, of positive thinking, rather than casting it in negative terms. So that becomes important. So, there's another storyline that accompanies this. The idea is that she's shifting from arguments of simplicity, certainty, and immediacy to engaging complexity, engaging uncertainty, and essentially engaging long term. This is, I think, is a complementary storyline along with the one essentially shifting essentially from the bad news to the good news. Okay, so it's the interweaving essentially of these two ideas, two storylines, which I think are central essentially to a changing message in that regard. So, Sebastian Moffat presented this graphic, and it's a very powerful one. It declares essentially the erosion of natural capital. Which essentially, we think of almost us as a species, like many other millions of species, are dependent on the health and essentially on diversity that exists in the natural world. And so there's a lot of pressures which have led to the erosion of that natural capital. And like anything, we hear that storyline essentially about there's a margin period of time where we need to make serious changes if we're going to avert serious problems. But what Mount Moffat does, having presented this, what are the ways in which we can essentially steer a path out of this possible problem? He identifies two. One, regeneration. Again, building up this case, essentially maybe the idea of regeneration essentially of lost natural capital. The other, essentially, dematerialization. How do we provide the services that society needs with radically reduced flows of energy and material? And we take this first one on dematerialization because it's the one I think you start to see happening in a variety of different ways. Collaborative consumption, it's emerging in North America. Why do I need essentially a car when I can just lease one for a period of time when I need it? Again, so you start to find all these various ways and start to say, well, actually, I just want the services that something offers rather than the thing itself. So you can imagine basically now we have this shared economy or collaborative economy. That is one manifestation, if you will, of a dematerialization. Going back essentially to our time frame, it always amazes me how much has happened in a relatively short period of time. The World Wide Web in 1993, and amazing developments have occurred essentially over a relatively short period of time. The enormous capabilities essentially that these information and communication technologies have offered us. And it's good and bad from an environmental standpoint. The good, basically, the collaborative combinations, is facilitating collaborative collaboration and the collaborative economy. But e-waste, it's just, I saw one of the Wilson lectures, and was for the first time given a shock about just the extent of e-waste. You start thinking pretty much in North America, in the mid-1970s, there's this one computer for every 1,000 people. By 2010, 800 computers essentially for 1,000 people. Now, along with all essentially cell phones, all this incredible amount of stuff, again, gets discarded relatively quickly. And where does it flow? Essentially, it flows pretty much from the high-regulated, basically the high-pay context of the United States, essentially flowing essentially to an unregulated, low-pay parts of the world. So, but it's a massive, massive flow of this e-waste, and the volume of it is clearly increasing. So, but this is going to be problematic in that sense. Now, the collaborative economy, the drivers for this, there's never one reason why something happens. Things happen because of a combination of a whole host of different things. The economic crisis, 2000 economic crisis, unemployment, monetary, companies in ways having monetary success or idle inventory, increased financial flexibility, access over ownership. We have pretty much a technological capability, information communication technologies, and now essentially enabling us essentially to find out who's got what. So if you're going to share things, you need to have some sense of who's got what and is willing to actually share it. Then you've got putting in some societal issues here. Maybe there's a changing emerging ethic, desire essentially for altruism or wanting less material wealth. So a whole series of things collectively conspiring which are driving this agenda. And you start looking at those reports and say, pretty much there seems to be a fairly broad-based interest in engaging in this shared economy, to change things. So you start looking at pretty much different parts of the world, where people who are willing to essentially borrow from somebody are willing to actually share with somebody. So it seems to be a growing change out there, which would support, I would argue, essentially, that we can do significant strides in dematerializing our way in which we operate. The repair cafes are another kind of emerging, if you will, characterization, where essentially, rather than essentially having something, it's broken, I throw it away, now I can take it somewhere and have it repaired. Now, the important thing about these repair cafes, they're not simply about essentially the environmental benefits of actually having reduced waste. It's the social benefits, essentially, of engaging with others. It's the cafe culture, which is much more about social than it is about anything else. So now start to see these things emerging, and I suspect with time we're going to see more and more of them. I see these as incredibly positive signs, essentially, of a change towards dematerialization. Okay, so now I'm going to move towards the regenerative. What do we understand by this regenerative idea? Why is it so potent that maybe essentially the other environmental agendas have been less so potent? So Stephen Moore, he just wrote this recent article, what gets done in almost any society is largely determined by who gets to define or frame the problem at hand. So who frames things? It profoundly influences essentially the kinds of things, the kinds of outcomes that come from it. From the point I went about is this notion of worldview. That slide I showed you earlier was this shift maybe from a mechanistic worldview to an ecological worldview. I've never seen that as being so profoundly important in really understanding the kinds of changes we need to make. So worldviews, I think we're all aware of them, what it is. We're not typically always aware that we all hold a worldview, and that pretty much dictates the way we see and understand the world about us. It certainly creates and influences the questions we ask, the solution we seek, and the tools we use. So the worldview that we have becomes profoundly important in that regard. So the mechanistic worldview, the language of the mechanistic worldview, largely about reductive, anthropocentric, it's about efficiency. You start looking at mechanistic worldview and it translates to values, goals, rules, and actions and tools. Pretty much green building, the green building practices we have today still largely sit under that umbrella of mechanistic worldview. And the tools we have, the building environmental assessment methods, are again a manifestation of a reductive approach. You open up any of those assessment tools, basically it has a series of performance criteria. Essentially you describe the building into distinct categories: site, water, materials, energy, indoor environment quality. Credits, basically you add them all up, and that addition is supposed to give you some indication of how a building actually is. Okay? I don't buy it. Anyway, so now we start to see now an ecological worldview, which is much holistic and systems-based, pretty much biocentric, and rather than efficiency, it's about effectiveness. Rather than saying how efficient is something, I think we need to ask a question, and again, the storyline is not how efficient it is, but how effective it is in terms of what it does. Really different in terms of language there. So now we have these good approaches, and there are a different kind of set of tools which are emerging out of them. And so things about this become quite important. Okay, so now we start looking at what is the changing storyline. Green outcomes. We'll talk about green outcomes. And these are the embodiment, pretty much, of every green building assessment tool. It's all about reducing damage to natural and sensitive sites, reducing the need for new construction infrastructure, reducing the impacts of natural features and society during construction, reducing potential environmental damage from emissions and outflows, reducing, you can read them. But it's all about reducing. My God, working with essentially a creative profession like architecture, where basically it's all about invention, it's all about looking, and basically you're slapping on essentially a creative design profession all the things they can't do. all the things they can't do. It's a depressing and uninspiring list of responsibilities we have. You shift over to the other side, essentially to the regenerative outcomes, restoring and enhancing local ecosystem function capacity, creating net positive synergies, connections between urban metabolism and basic ecological systems, enhancing, building, improving, building, generating. It's a positive message. Again, so I would argue in terms of if you're a design professional and basically you're beaten to a pulp based on all the things you can't do, and you see something which restores within you a latent desire, essentially, that I can essentially make a positive contribution through each and every act of my design. So that's one thing. So this is pretty much about doing this harm. I've slammed it, but I don't want to diminish it. It's important. We clearly need to essentially slow things down, but we can't simply stop them. The responsibility must shift over essentially this side, where we also have a responsibility to make positive contributions through every action we take in the production of the built environment. So that becomes important for us. So now start looking at these tools fundamentally. On this side of the account, green building, pretty much doing this harm, and the logical outcome of doing this harm is doing no harm, the zero. So pretty much net zero is the end game, if you will, essentially of what I would say is not what we should do. So now it's just basically, we start there now, start to do more good. So it's the relationship between these two become hugely important. Both important responsibilities, but you can't have this and this alone. And I don't believe that somehow net zero applied to each and every building is an appropriate strategy. I would say how effective is each building in contributing to the success and health, essentially, of the built environment. So different responsibilities. So this is Thomas Berry. It's a bit light there, but basically that's that mechanistic and that's essentially the ecological view. And this is what it comes. It's a beautiful characterization of where we are. We are in trouble right now because we do not have a good story. We are between stories. And we have not yet learned a new story. So most of the day-to-day practice is dominated by this, yet we're trying to move towards that. And it's a very uncomfortable place to be. I think most professionals know that. We know we've got to do better, but we're kind of buried within essentially a whole series of institutional concerns, regulatory concerns, financial mechanisms, essentially, which are holding us profoundly in that sense. So being between stories is hugely problematic. At our centre, we've been trying to understand what does it mean to be here. Ideally, probably we need to emphasize that, we're locked in that, but what's it mean to be in the middle there? So that's the thing in terms of we're trying to understand how, as we transition from one essentially dominant worldview to an emergent one, and the consequences that has essentially in the provisions of environment. So, but the big difference between these tools is another thing. A lot of those are essentially about assessing performance, which is okay, but where's the guidance about how you get there? So pretty much all of the regenerative tools are more process-based. They're all about essentially offering some kind of directive about how we essentially navigate our way through essentially to maybe an improved condition. So that plays out. So this is the thing for me which is hugely important strategically. If we're going to ramp up performance over time, and I assume that's a good thing to be doing, we want to essentially ramp up essentially the environmental performance of buildings over time, but simultaneously we need essentially to ramp up commitment and basic capability of all those stakeholders associated with the provision program. They have to go together. You can't simply ramp up performance without equally considering the consequences of what's required to do so. So we've been trying to understand what essentially this co-evolution essentially of ramping up performance and the kinds of changes in the capabilities we require to deliver on that promise. So that's essentially a really quite important thing. The other thing I think which you're all familiar with is all these building environmental assessment methods, they started out with versions for building. You know, the French HQE system, pretty much leading North America, BREEAM in UK, the German system, Australia here, the Japanese. All started essentially with a version for buildings, and over the last 5 or 6 years or so, they all introduced a version of neighbourhoods. Raising the possibility in many ways, is the building the most appropriate unit for a serious discussion about regeneration? Or is it maybe at the neighbourhood scale? Or is it something to do with a combination of both? Something like that. So that's essentially where we are in that sense. Now, when you start looking at them, It's in many ways the same kind of mentality that we use to buildings to rank them certified, in North America, certified, silver, gold, platinum, and then apply essentially the same idea about essentially assessing neighbourhoods. I would argue maybe that's not where we probably want to go. Basically maybe to essentially identify a LEED platinum neighbourhood, a building I can probably live with, but it's that application to neighbourhood looks problematic to me. The French one doesn't evaluate the legal, evaluates the process. It's the first signal, essentially, that maybe in terms of, this is not about, essentially, the final performance, whatever that is. Maybe somehow we need to look at and understand the quality of the processes which are actually shaping and giving directions to the future. So I saw that play out. Green Star, this is the Australian assessment system. We actually look at the various categories in Green Star. This could be anything. I could use LEED, I could use BREEAM, I could use any of them to make the same point. But I put this together because I'm in Australia. Okay, so you've got management, indoor environmental quality, energy, transportation, water, materials. The classic breakdown of the criteria, the categories you see in an environmental assessment tool for buildings. I would argue they're qualitatively different, particularly essentially management is qualitatively different from the others. Management is largely a process issue, the others you could probably talk about performance. But a lot of these tools at the moment, they mix and blur essentially performance with process. And we've got to pull those apart. So that becomes our first one. Now you've got essentially to Green Star performance for communities. Again, you've got it divvied up into governance, design, livability, economic prosperity, environment, innovation. I would argue, again, there's a qualitative difference between one of those from the others, the notion of governance. Governance is largely a process issue. The others, we could probably have a discussion about performance. Again, but it's this mixing, if you will, essentially of performance and process, which is problematic. We're trying in many ways to push some fresh air between those two, understand them as both important, but you don't muddy the waters by putting them in a common overall assessment of essentially a building or a neighbourhood. In North America, we've seen the emergence of eco-districts. Eco-districts equally has its performance areas, health and wellness, mobility, connectivity, livability, prosperity, ecosystem stewardship, climate protection. But pretty much they start looking at, they now have that as essentially performance, but they have their own distinct, if you will, process for it. Look at all the various processes, engagement, commitment, so target setting, road mapping, all those are largely processes. So now you start to see, I think, we're in the stage now of the evolution of discussion about assessment is now a prizing apart of issues related to performance and issues related to process. And again, I suspect in 5 or 10 years, that distinction will be much clearer as it plays out. So, this is somehow things we've been wrestling with. We have a lot of discussion about buildings, we know a lot about buildings. Buildings we can describe with some specificity. You get up to scale of cities, again, city has been seen and presented by many as essentially the unit, where essentially we can be an instrument to assist us in this transition to a sustainable future. It becomes much more complex, as we saw. So we've got specificity, increasing complexity and diversity. We pretty much think there's something between them. The neighbourhood is probably one of the most potent scales, essentially, to affect, essentially, transformations. So we picked on, essentially, like we've seen going from building up, essentially, upper scale, we think pretty much there's a huge potency when we understand the notion of neighbourhood. Because we all live in it. You go around the world, almost any country, you see pretty much, the inhabitants of those cities identify very strongly with their neighbourhood context. The reason the neighbours is important because pretty much neighbours provide a setting for relationship networks. We have conversations within our neighbourhoods, okay? Community inhabitants live, work, and play with neighbourhoods. Pretty much community initiatives, actions, and festivals, celebrations occur in neighbourhoods. Okay? So, you know more than I than basically the situation in Sydney, but in Vancouver, my city, pretty much, I live in Kitsilano. Of course I live in Vancouver, I live in Western Canada, I live in the province of British Columbia, but I live in Kitsilano. That's the place I relate to. That's where I shop, that's where I meet people, so it's pretty much a scale that has this huge emotive value. And I think that becomes critical, essentially, in engaging people if they can relate to it. So how do neighbourhoods unfold? Niels Larson, in terms of presented this graphic, and it's kind of intriguing because neighbours have their trajectories. They have their histories, and they're evolving in their own way according to a whole host of different kind of forces. Changes in planning framework, regulations, cultural values, shifted density, cultural facilities, changes in real estate value, changes in the physical context, basically demographic changes that occur over time. So a whole series of things which influence how a neighbourhood unfolds over time. We are trying to understand how will climate change essentially influence not just buildings, but somehow influence all these various things that directly and indirectly shape a way in which a neighbourhood unfolds. So, close that one. But can we made the proposition, the hypothesis, that somehow we can, within a neighbourhood, we can make an intervention. And an intervention can encourage regenerative outcomes. It's a proposition, we don't know, but the idea is somehow, how do we intervene with the neighbourhood? What things can we do that can essentially start to change the dial, change the direction on the way in which a neighbourhood would unfold in a more regenerative manner. So that becomes important. So what things can we introduce? What kind of interventions can we have? Well, there's lots of them. There can be policy shifts, infrastructure, community initiatives, or buildings. Each of these has some potency to influence, essentially, how a neighbourhood may start to change, and evolve over time in maybe a more positive way. So we're trying to understand what these various interventions mean, individually and collectively, to start to shape, if you will, an unfolding agenda. So that's important. So we picked out performance areas, drawing very much on the work of Salvador Rueda in Barcelona. If you don't know his work, it's worth looking at. He's pretty much got this 600-page comprehensive report, pretty much, on a whole range of environmental sustainability metrics that can be used essentially to have a decent discussion about what things we're doing well and what things we're doing poorly. So we have cultural practices, ecological integrity, social cohesion, urban metabolism, and urban ecology. So there's a whole series of things where we can have a much more comprehensive way of having a discussion about what the current state, in many ways, of the neighbourhood is, and basically how we somehow move forward in a regenerative way. And so we've done this first cut to try and look at some various interventions within Richmond and Surrey. They're essentially two municipalities adjacent to Vancouver, to try and understand if we make certain kind of interventions, how do we move forward across those performance metrics. It's qualitative at the moment. We think we can get a pretty good understanding somehow of understanding different kind of interventions and their potential essentially to improve performance. So that's what we think we can do. We think we basically understand the interventions and its consequence and measure to some level, basically, has there been an improvement? But the question we're faced with, by actually meeting these better in these various performance areas, does it lead us to regenerative outcomes? Can we say with any certainty somehow, by simply moving the dial essentially across these performance metrics, does it actually transition us towards regenerative outcomes? We don't know. We don't know because, why do we know? Because pretty much, if you look at those regenerative outcomes, which I mentioned earlier, pretty much there's such a complex interweaving, essentially, of how those various performance areas, directly and indirectly, affect different kind of regenerative outcomes. So we're trying to unravel this to understand how do we move essentially from intervention, having some way of having a discussion about where we're making progress, but then having some greater level of confidence that this actually takes us to and being able to say, yes, it seems like we're moving in a direction towards certain regenerative outcomes. It becomes a little bit messy in that regard. But the decision we made was essentially, if this is about performance, we borrowed these largely from eco-districts, essentially, as process issues. We're keeping these very separate. A discussion about performance, and like eco-districts, essentially, identifying a whole series of different mechanisms that are required, essentially, to enable us, essentially, to move forward at the neighbourhood scale. I used this several times because I said part of that storyline is moving from certainty to uncertainty. Moving from certainty to uncertainty. Everything about the current world basically is premised on certainty. As a design professional, you've got to go essentially to your client and say, yes, I'm going to give you a project, it's going to perform in this way. With great certainty. I know it's going to perform that. So you instill a sense of certainty, even though we know, in reality, basically, what we propose and how it plays out in practice are widely different things. But David Snowden came up and said, you need to devise ways of measuring success without knowing in advance exactly what success might be. That's an incredibly problematic issue to wrestle with in terms of how we frame it. We presented this idea of regenerative framework, regenerative ideas, and all the questions that typically go up saying, how do I tell my client that I'm giving them a regenerative project? With the lead, you basically, when the paint's drying or the design stage, you can show them they've got a lead platinum or a lead gold, and there's some comfort level that goes with it. Oh God, they've given me a lead platinum building. I feel satisfied now. Because it was done when the paint's drying on the building. But basically, we're talking about interventions into a neighbourhood that through the fullness of time, basically, they're start, when did you start to say, yes, I'm there? When you'll never be there. So having essentially an open-ended storyline raises huge problems, essentially, for how do we communicate what is successful, what's successful, when it's unfolding the story. So wrestling that becomes hugely important. Okay, so this is the last piece. Going back to Margaret Wheatley. People support what they create. If you have a direct hand in creating something, you will support it. Or do I try and do it, right? People act responsible when they care. If you don't care about something, we don't care about, I said, what do we care about? What do we value? If you don't value essentially the land, basically, we should perfectly comfortable to see it essentially ravaged. So getting people essentially care becomes important. But this last one, expect leaders to come from anywhere. I start off essentially by painting this a political portrait, if you will, of Canada and the absence of leadership. So if basically we don't get the leadership there, where is the leadership going to come from? Okay? I think certainly Canada, I don't know whether Australia is different, but pretty much at the national level, federal level, basically at the provincial level, at the city level, things are happening. But I would go down the scale and say, where is leadership coming essentially from the bottom up? I think that's a bit more interesting in that sense. So, getting close to the end here about community initiatives. Let's look at essentially the potency of a community initiative, essentially, to improve the quality, if you will, of a neighbourhood. Does anybody know the work of Jason Roberts? Yeah. Jason Roberts? I heard yes. Better Blocks. It's absolutely amazing. If you haven't, essentially, he's done a TED talk. He's more inspiring than I'll ever be, but basically, you should go look at it. Because there's an Eco District Summit in Washington, D.C. last year, and he was the keynote speaker. And I was absolutely moved by what he'd done. Again, I asked you to imagine, because he operates in a way that's not consistent with mainstream practice, but nonetheless, what he's doing and how he's going about doing it, I think we can learn a lot. So he lives in Oak Cliff, just outside Dallas, Texas. And he presents these images of basically his neighborhood. Not a human being on the street, basically trucks and cars basically either park or drive straight through. It's a soulless place in his own language, in his own words. So this is an individual within this neighborhood standing up and saying, I'm going to change this place. I'm going to improve essentially Oak Cliff. This is my place. This is where I live. Basically, I'm going to make improvements to it. So he went through essentially and created kind of blocks. He's most widely known essentially for this activity. Essentially, if traffic is whistling through Oak Cliff, how do you slow it down? Basically, he goes out with his buddies on the weekend essentially and paints crosswalks. Or he paints cycle paths, basically. He puts in place essentially things which are considerably of value essentially to the community. He's trying to essentially, I think, unlock a latent desire of his community members to affect change, affect positive change. So it plays out in that regard. What he also says basically goes to essentially the Dallas essentially code. This is remarkable. Because he then just picks out a few things like sidewalk flowers. You want to put like flowers on the sidewalk, it's going to cost you $1,000. This is not a rich neighbourhood. Basically, if you basically want a cafe, which typically brings a fair amount of street life to any kind of community, basically you have to pay for it. No money. Okay, and the last one basically you can't get kind of a crowd. More than 2 people is a crowd. Basically, you're in jail. So you can't gather on the sidewalk. So where did this thing come from? Well, pretty much 1940, basically may have had some value then, but pretty much in 2015, what's the potency, if you will, essentially, or the value of these archaic, essentially, rules? They basically prevent everything that somehow one considerably supportive, if you will, of a quality neighbourhood experience. So he goes in and does all this stuff, this renegade stuff, to try and essentially transform that to that. And of course, what he does, essentially, he invites then all the councils along. They come out and they walk around and say, this is pretty neat, there's a lot of life on the street, and they're all excited. And of course, they get this, oh my God, he's breaking every rule in the book here. So it's a pretty deep problem here. We've invited to something which is actually kind of illegal. But essentially now he tells this wonderful story about the fact that somehow, on the quiet, essentially the councils ring him up and say, you may want to deal with this. So he's actually got this kind of, but again, it's just showing in terms of the actions of one. Now, you can probably say, well, that's nice because these are about $5,000, $1,000 interventions. Yeah. But what he tells us a more powerful story is he realized pretty much that way back in history, from 1889 to 1956, there was essentially a streetcar service running through Oakland. Abandoned in 1956. So he said basically in 2008, I'm going to bring this round. They're going to bring the streetcar back. And all he's got is saying, you're nuts. Because basically, working essentially with essentially doing the old painting of the sidewalks is one thing, but essentially bringing back essentially a streetcar, essentially is a whole different kind of a level. And so what does he do? Essentially he creates a website. Creates a website of a non-existent open just like that. He wants to say he creates a website of a non-existent authority. And out there, of course, there's been phone calls and we say, well, I used to work on rail cars, but so all these kind of to tease out essentially from the community, essentially people that would never otherwise be close. So a critical thing he said, you've got to give something a name. Things need a name. Sustainability doesn't kind of do it. So giving something a specific name, like the Oak Cliff Transit Authority, is something that essentially a public can relate to in a very direct and meaningful way. So he did that, and then they managed to actually get essentially this fairly massive, $40 million, which $23 million were directed essentially at the re-establishment of the streetcar. Again, one guy with an ambition essentially to create change and manifested this turnaround. Again, nothing can be more remarkable essentially about it. And it essentially opened 2 weeks ago. So you've got to see, again, I'm doing a very poor impersonation of Jason Roberts. Again, it just shows you about the extent of neighbourhood initiatives and the consequence they can have. So that becomes hugely important. So I'm going to wrap up the presentation here by going back to a quotation here. Confucius advises that if we hope to repair what is wrong with the world, we had best start with the rectification of names. The corruption of society begins with the failure to call things by their proper names, and its renovation begins with the reattachment of words of real meaning and precise concepts. I mention this because we're incredibly sloppy about the language we use to describe environmental issues in buildings. Okay? To give you a case in point, okay? I think with all legitimacy, we can talk about a building being a green building. A building can essentially reduce the amount of energy it uses, materials, resources, reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. It can do that. And so somehow I think it's pretty much a little bit, a green building can significantly reduce environmental impacts. Then we come to the one that's always buckling, big enough. Okay? Sustainable building. But what an awkward and meaningless term. Jeremy Gibbon in South Africa first used this idea. A building in of itself cannot be sustainable. I hear these things, well, the path has been around for a long, it's a sustainable building. It's just lasted a long time. And does that make it sustainable? Lasting a long time. Presumably we're looking at a great expectation about what something's offering rather than simply lasting a long time. So I don't think Vancouver can be a sustainable city. I don't think British Columbia can be a sustainable province. I don't think Canada can be a sustainable. We're totally interdependent, essentially, with everything else that happens in the world. So the application of the term sustainability is something other than the planet is a meaningless level to have that discussion. So if a building can't be sustainable, what can it be? What can it be? For me, basically, buildings can be designed to support sustainable patterns of living. Again, shifting essentially from the object, the thing being sustainable, to the role that thing does. And again, it's this reconceptualization of what building is. In terms, it's not the thing, it's basically what benefits accrue from that thing starts to become hugely important. So going to this last one, a building in of itself cannot be regenerative. I think we have liver transplants where you take a piece of liver and it will regenerate. I've yet to come across a building which can do that. You may have, but I can't. I'm sure you might have, but it hasn't happened. Okay, so a building in of itself cannot be regenerative. So let's not put the word regenerative in front of building. Okay? So you ask yourself then, a building can be designed to be a positive agent in a continual positive evolution place. That's what I think the act of building, the act of design is all about. It clearly needs to meet the program requirements because that's the thing that initiates the building. But what the expectation is now is that essentially through our actions of design, the building does more than that. It contributes much more something more positive to the context which it sits. With that, I'm going to stop. So thank you.